Les Hills Wild Ones is honored and proud to be a part of the Siouxland Garden Show. We are co-sponsors of two outstanding speakers. Benjamin Vogt, who is an author and garden designer who lives in Nebraska. He speaks nationally on garden design and landscape ethics at conferences and seminars. And Doug Tallamy, who is a familiar name to many worldwide, encouraging each of us in our own spaces to become a part of growing a homegrown national park. You can source plants for these nature gardens by going to leshills.wildones.org and clicking on the 2021 plant sale list. There you will find stunning photos and details of these native plants. Les Hills Wild Ones also hosts classes, field trips, a complimentary fall seed exchange, and many more fun and educational activities. Come join us and add some wild to your spaces. We can't wait to meet you.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our last week of the Siouxland Garden Show. My name is Caitlin Brinkerhoff. I'm with Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, and I have Carol Larvik with Nebraska Extension. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into our welcome PowerPoint here. So just a reminder for everyone to go ahead and join us in the comments. We'd love to know where you're joining us from. And if you're a master gardener, or if you're just really interested in today's topic, this is also going to be the area where you can ask questions to our presenter. So feel free to find that comments box if you're watching on Facebook Live. If you're watching on our website, feel free to go ahead and open that video up into a browser. It's actually a YouTube link. So if you have a YouTube account, you can go ahead and ask questions there as well. So feel free to jump in the comments, let us know where you're joining us from, and so that you can ask questions throughout the presentation. And so this year we've had a great lineup of all different types of presentations this year. We have one more to finish out our Siouxland Garden Show. It's about using annuals and perennials in the landscape. So make sure to join us this afternoon at 3 p.m. Central Time. If you want some more information, or if you'd like to go back and watch any of our other sessions, you can go to the Siouxland Garden Show website page. You can find the description for this afternoon's presentation, as well as finding the archive sessions for all of 2021, as well as 2020 if you're interested. And a big thank you to our Siouxland Garden Show committee that helps us put on this great show. So back in September, we had to make the tough decision to go virtual for 2021, or stay virtual. And we had to make that quick decision in 2020 as well. So we had just about a couple weeks to make the 2020 show happen. So we're excited to at least have some more planning time for the 2021 show. So this is a collaborative effort between Iowa State University Extension and Outreach in Woodbury County, as well as Nebraska Extension in Dakota County. So we have Carrie King, Carol Larvik, Molly Hewitt, myself, Caitlin Brinkerhoff, Kevin Pottabaum, Emily Yockey, and the bottom three are master gardeners. We have Rex Towns, Randy Burnnight, and Diana Kincaid. So a big thank you to this committee on working hard on putting together a great virtual 2 years of virtual shows, and working on now putting together our in-person show to be back in person. So go ahead and save the date for our 2022 show. We're planning on being back in person at the Marriott Center in South Sioux City, Nebraska. So we'll have lots of space, lots of good parking. We're so excited to be back with everyone. So it's going to be April 2nd and April 3rd. It's 2 full days for you guys to come out, shop, learn, and grow. We have a Winter's Farmers Market. We'll have education presentations. We have children's play area. Master gardeners will be out there to help answer any questions you guys might have. And it's only $5 per day to join us. So if you haven't been out before, we definitely would love to see you there next year. And another big thank you to all of our volunteers and vendors. We have over 70 Master Gardener volunteers that help us put on the in-person show, with helping answer questions, set up, organizing things with vendors, all kinds of different jobs. So we miss everyone, and we're really, really looking forward to being back in person in 2022. And a big thank you to all of our vendors for continuing to provide great products for our community, as well as awesome education as well. So looking forward to next year. And another big thank you to all of our sponsors that help us put on not only our virtual shows, but also our in-person shows. So you can always check the top left corner on who's sponsoring today's session. If you'd like to know more about our sponsors, feel free to check out our website. You can hover over their logo and it will take you to their website so you can learn a little bit more about them. All right, so now we are going to go ahead and get Doug up onto the screen and get his presentation up here. So I'm going to go ahead and get that out of the way. All right, Doug, we have you up here and I have your presentation on the screen. So Carol and I are going to go ahead and jump off and the stage is yours.
All right, thanks very much, Caitlin. Welcome, everybody. I want to talk about my idea of what nature's best hope is. But before I do that, I want to return to what happened not this fall, but the previous fall. In the East, we had what we call an oak mast, where all the members of the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. I was rewarded. An insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a hole for its head, forced its head through there, then it forced the rest of its body through. It was a very tight squeeze, made it look like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Finally plopped down. This is a dangerous time for this insect larva because it is good to eat. Lots of things are after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming below the surface of the soil in about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, it converts itself to a pupa and stays there for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. Now, a lot of people think weevils have big noses, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule. And the mouth parts are way down here at the end of that extension. And they take those mouth parts, chew a hole down into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in it, and that's how the larva gets into the acorn. You might wonder why they spend 2 years underground. Why don't they just come out the next year like most insects? Well, red oak acorns take 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the very next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. After the acorn weevil has left the acorn, that leaves a hole, a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. In this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants that make their home inside the acorns that have been hollowed out by acorn weevils. And if they find a new acorn, they're excited because their old acorn's falling apart. So they tell everybody, time to move. They grab the larvae, they grab the eggs, the pupae, and they all move into the new acorn. Post a guard here to make sure nobody else comes. That only takes about 30 minutes. And then they'll live there for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. Well, about this time, my wife says, what's your point? What are you trying to tell us? I'm trying to tell you that that is just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions that comprise most of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and oaks. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll pick up an acorn in the fall, and they'll fly up to a mile from the parent tree. Tap that oak that acorn beneath the surface of the soil. And the idea, of course, is that they're going to go back in the wintertime and find that and have something to eat. Well, a single jay can bury 4,500 acorns in the fall, but they're not that good in remembering where they were. So many of them end up planting about 3,000 oak trees every single year. Very valuable service to oaks. Found out this fall what is pollinating witch hazel. Witch hazel, of course, blooms late in the fall. Leaves are down after frost. And you go and you look at the flowers, you never see anything on there. But if you go out at night and look, you might see this. This is one of the winter moths. This is the bicolored sallow that also fly very late. I caught a bicolored sallow on Christmas Eve this year. And it turns out they're the major pollinators of witch hazel. And I don't know whether winter moths are flying late to take advantage of witch hazel or whether witch hazel is blooming late to take advantage of winter moths. But at this point, they're taking advantage of each other. Another specialized relationship. You won't have breeding pileated woodpeckers near you unless you have lots of carpenter ants, because that is what they rear their young on. And you won't have those carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have facilia. That's the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have about 4,000 species of native bees, and over a third of them are highly specialized. They can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plant genera. So in the upper Midwest, there are at least 13 species of bees that can only reproduce on the pollen of perennial sunflowers. You won't have Baltimore checker spot unless you have a white turtlehead. I could talk all day about nature's specialized relationships. The problem is that today, those relationships, nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we did not listen to Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, stood on the edge, looked out over its magnificent view, and he said, "Leave it as it is." And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. But, we can't leave the country as it was because we haven't. There's only about 45% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And that's because we've logged the country repeatedly. We've tilled it. We've drained it. We've grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland in this country. That is 4.5 times the size of Texas. And of course, we paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we have carved up the natural world into tiny remnants of its former self. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the species that run the ecosystems that we all depend on. Why have we done that? Well, I imagine we thought that the Earth, our nest, was so large that we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that. And that's why we're seeing very frightening headlines like this. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. That's 1/3 of our North American bird population gone. Now the UN says, well, we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, probably in the next 20 years. Then they go on to the next headline. They might as well say we're going to lose oxygen in the next 20 years and go on to the next headline as if it doesn't matter. That's not an option. We can't lose oxygen. We can't lose 1 million species. We have to make sure those things don't happen. Well, I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment and thus upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return to this headline briefly. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, E.O. Wilson, the greatest entomologist of all times, still alive. He's 92, I think. Harvard emeritus, writes a book every year. But he told us what would happen to planet Earth if insects were to disappear. And he did it way back in 1987 in this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappear, that would so radically change energy flow through our terrestrial habitats that the food webs that support our animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, the mammals, and even many of our freshwater fish, those food webs would collapse and those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. The good news is that doesn't have to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why do we have to do that? Remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on healthy ecosystems because they produce what we call ecosystem services, the things that keep us alive on this planet. Here are some of the things that plants deliver to us, humans, but also to everything else, like the production of oxygen, pretty important. Clean water. Plants are slowing the journey water takes after it falls from the sky to the sea where it's too salty to use. They're capturing carbon, enormously important today, pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, out of harm's way, using the carbon to build their tissues, but then they pump the extra carbon into the ground. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have deposited there over the centuries. They build topsoil, hold it in place, they prevent floods, they dampen severe weather, lots of important things. What do animals do for plants? Well, they provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds and other important things. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services, it's just not a good idea these days. It never was a good idea, but today it's a downright terrible idea. We have 7.9 billion people on the planet right now. That number grows every day. It does not shrink. We need more ecosystem services every day. More than we've ever needed in the past. So taking huge areas of the Earth out of production, just a bad idea. There have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with the only planet that supports us. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. And one of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, there have been indigenous groups that have been good at doing that for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, then moving to another area, completely wrecking that. And Aldo recognized that was not a sustainable relationship. So he had this dream that he called a land ethic. He dreamt that we would actually be able to learn how to use the earth to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all those things, but learn how to do it gently enough that we could do it without destroying local ecosystems. And that's what he called a land ethic. He wrote about it in the same county almanac. What he didn't talk about was actually developing a land ethic where we lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, it's still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have recognized it as an option. What I want to argue this morning is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head. We need to save nature, actually recreate it where we've dismantled it, where there are a lot of people, because that is most places. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, but thrive. Where are we going to do that? Well, one place we cannot ignore is private property. 85.6% of the U.S. east of the Mississippi is privately owned. 75% of the whole country is privately owned. If we ignored private property when we did conservation, we would fail, because we wouldn't be doing conservation in enough places. But there are a lot of places where we could be doing conservation, where right now we're not doing a good job of that. How about power and pipeline rights of ways? We've got 21 million acres in those types of landscapes. There's some conservation going on there, but we can do a lot better. Railroad rights of ways, another 3 million acres. Golf courses, 2 million acres. Airports, 3 million acres. The Denver airport is twice the size of Manhattan. Roadsides, 17 million acres. Then all the places we live, both in rural areas and suburbia, our cities, hundreds of millions of acres in those landscapes. You add up just those areas, and you can think of others. That's 599 million acres where we could be doing a lot better in terms of conservation. How big is 599 million acres? It's big. It's bigger than Vermont, plus New Jersey, plus Maine, plus Virginia, New York, Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma, plus Montana, plus California. Even throw Texas in there. Not having a place to do conservation is not the issue. We can do conservation almost anywhere. Now, when I talk about conservation, I'm using the word loosely. I'm really talking about, again, rebuilding nature. It's a form of restoration, but we're not trying to put back exactly what was there. I mean, it'd be great, but we probably can't do that. What we are trying to do is reunite as many of those specialized relationships as we can, the ones that run ecosystems, so that we can produce those ecosystem services. But not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally. So we have to start with the building blocks, the most important species. There's two groups that we can't do without. We need those flowering plants because they're capturing the energy from the sun, most of the energy from the sun, and turning it into food, which is then stored in their leaves. But you're not going to have flowering plants unless you have the pollinators that allow them to reproduce. So that's one group that we need. Now we have the energy from the sun locked up in plant leaves, but if we don't get that energy to animals, it's a dead-end food web, and you still have a failed ecosystem. Most vertebrates don't eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants. That something typically is insects, and it turns out that caterpillars transfer more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater, which means we need to design landscapes that have a lot of caterpillars, or again, you have a failed food web. Most of the energy will remain locked up in the plant leaves. Let's use the Carolina chickadee as an example. As you move further north, becomes the black-capped chickadee, but they're all doing the same thing. Chickadees, of course, are the common birds that are feeders. They're eating seeds, and many people think that's all a chickadee needs. Well, that's 50% of its diet in the wintertime. The other 50% is insects. But when they're reproducing, their babies can't eat seeds. So they switch entirely to insects. And if they're in a healthy environment, they will feed their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects. And it turns out most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? Well, there's several lines of evidence that suggest that. But this is a citizen science project that one of my students recently finished, Ashley Kennedy. She put out a call to bird photographers from all over the country to take pictures of birds during the breeding season when they were carrying food to the nest. They were going to send those pictures to Ashley. She was going to identify the prey items that were in the birds' beaks and reconstruct the nestling diet for as many birds in North America as possible. She got thousands of pictures and was able to reconstruct the nestling diet for 20 of the common bird families in North America. The green bars that you're looking at here are the percentage of those nestling diets that were caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 common bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, what would happen to, in this case, bird breeding success if we took caterpillars out of the system? Most of our birds would not be able to reproduce. So there's something special about caterpillars. What is it? Actually, there's several things special about caterpillars. The first one is they're soft. So think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is exoskeleton. It's cuticle made of chitin that is undigestible, and the birds don't want a lot of that. And because the caterpillar is soft, you can stuff it down the throat of your baby without fear of injuring it. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Their beak is like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar. They're nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, very low percentage of chitin compared to many other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible, and many beetles have sharp edges. And it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate, and you're a vertebrate, and birds are vertebrates. And we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. And that's why my wife, Cindy, makes sure I have lots of carrots to get my beta carotene and lots of tomatoes to get my lycopene, lots of whatever that is to get my lutein. And when I eat those things, it stimulates my immune system. Can't think of a better time to have a very healthy immune system. Carotenoids are antioxidants. They run around our body, protect our DNA from oxidative damage. They improve color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you will see better, she was right. She didn't know she was right, but it turns out she was right. They improve sperm vitality, improve sexual attractiveness. Excuse me. Now we're talking about birds like this prothonotary warbler male, who is bright yellow because he's had access to lots of luteins. And he takes those luteins, makes pigments out of them, puts them in his feathers. And the brighter yellow he is, the more ladies he attracts. So where are the birds getting their carotenoids from? From the invertebrate prey that they eat. But you can see carotenoid levels are not equally distributed among invertebrates. These first two bars here are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of insects because they're eating the green leaves where the carotenoids are. Third bar is orthopterids, things like grasshoppers and crickets and katydids. Here are the adult caterpillars down here, the moths and butterflies themselves. They don't have as many carotenoids because they're not eating green leaves. It's their caterpillars that eat the green leaves. And here's the earthworm way over here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So these data and many more from other studies are suggesting very strongly that caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets. They are essential parts of bird diets. So let's just say birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? Is one or two enough, or one or two a day enough? Good question. Let's go back to chickadees. We have a lot of data on chickadees, and they're good model systems for most of the birds that are out there. Well, how many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of chickadees? One or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands of caterpillars to make one clutch of chickadees, just to get them to the point where they leave the nest. 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars, depending on the number of chicks in the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days, but they're flying all around, so nobody can count those. And if you want chickadees breeding in your yard, and we do, because in so many places, that's all that's left is our yards, you have to have all those caterpillars in your yard. Chickadees are foraging about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we don't landscape in a way that has all those caterpillars available to the chickadees, that's called insect decline that is directly linked to bird decline. We went to the original data set from Rosenberg et al., they were the group that said we have lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the terrestrial birds up into 2 groups, the ones that require insects at some part of their life history, typically when they're reproducing, and the birds that don't require insects, things like finches and doves that can reproduce on seeds. They actually gained some numbers in the last 50 years, but the birds that require insects, on average, lost 10 million individuals per species. It doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly is suggestive that as insects go, so go our birds and everything else that requires those insects, which are a lot of things that I'm not talking about today. In the language of COVID, in an abundance of caution, we better start landscaping in a way that creates a lot of caterpillars and other insects. We're going to lose the biodiversity around us. And that is a different goal from the way we've landscaped in the past. In the past, we've considered plants just to be decorations, and we didn't want anything to eat our decorations. So we made sure that we had nothing in our landscapes, and that created dead landscapes. So if we're going to add caterpillars to our landscapes, we have to add the plants that make those caterpillars, or it's not going to work. And that seems easy enough, but there is a catch. And the catch is that most plants don't make a lot of caterpillars, which means we have to be fussy about the plants that we're choosing for our landscapes. And we have to be fussy because the caterpillars we're trying to support are fussy. And the monarch butterfly illustrates it perfectly. You can have all the calorie pear and all the burning bush and all the barberry and all the camellias and any of the Asian ornamentals that we use frequently for landscaping in your yard, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly is one of the milkweeds. That is called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are what we call host plant specialists. Why is that? Well, they're specialists because plants have made them specialize. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there are no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They're simply too well defended. And if you don't believe me, this summer, go out and eat a plant. See if you like it. You're not going to like it. There's a reason it's hard to get our kids to eat their vegetables. They inherently know that they're toxic. That's my little joke. This is not a joke, though. Insects do eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. Every plant lineage that's out there protects itself with a unique cocktail of chemical defenses. And any one insect species cannot adapt to all of them. That's just too much. So they pick one or two and they get really good at getting around those particular defenses. They develop the particular enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those particular compounds. The particular behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those particular compounds. But it takes a long period of evolutionary history with those plants for all those adaptations to fall into place. It doesn't happen overnight. And once they do fall into place, the insect can eat those plants, but only those plants. They're locked into what they specialize on because they didn't get any adaptations to eat the other plants. And that's why when we bring in plants from other continents, our insects are very poor at eating them. They're unable to eat them for the most part, which means plant choice matters. If we're trying to reestablish food webs that support the life around us, we've got to pick the plants that are going to do it because most plants won't. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how easy this can be and how well it works when we do pick the right plants. And I'm going to start with our house right here in southeastern Pennsylvania. This is what it looked like when we moved in. I'm sitting in this window right up here. This was a farm that was broken up. We have 10 acres on this farm. And the last thing the farm did, is a very old farm, been farmed for 300 years. The last thing they did before they sold the property was to mow it for hay. So there were very, very few plants there. So our goal was to reestablish the biodiversity on this plot of land by putting the right plants back. But we knew that we had to put in the plants that support the caterpillars that support the food web. And this is an example of how it went. I wanted the Canadian owlet on our property. I also wanted to take its picture. I'd never even seen a Canadian owlet. So in order to have Canadian owlets, you have to have the adult, which looks like a leaf, but you also have to have what they eat. They're specialists on meadow rue. Well, the meadow rue that used to be here is gone for hundreds of years. So I got some meadow rue seeds from someplace and planted them. They grew very nicely. But I really, I didn't know whether the Canadian owlet would be able to find my meadow rue or not. Maybe they had to come from Canada. I don't know. So I didn't go out and check it. It was about a month and a half after I planted it before I finally walked by. And the meadow rue was almost defoliated. The Canadian owlets had found it right away. Big surprise to me, but also big success. So now we have a very nice population of meadow rue and Canadian owlet. So we added 2 species to the property. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. That's actually a misnomer. This beautiful moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Bidens aristosa, ditch daisy. I did know where there were some Bidens in a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I got some seeds from there, planted them. They grew very nicely. Took about a year for the moth to find our Bidens, but it has. And now we've got a good population of both the Bidens and the moth. Now we've added 4 species to the property. Wanted the hackberry emperor. Not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it's a butterfly that should be at our house. Well, as its name implies, it's a specialist on hackberry. We didn't have any hackberry. So I planted hackberry. I had to wait 4 years for the butterflies to find our hackberry, but they did. I walked by one of my hackberries this past June, and there were 9 hackberry emperor butterfly caterpillars on a single branch. So another big success. There you go. Added 6 species. Didn't plant goldenrod. It came in on its own, and along with it came many of the things that eat goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. This is one that hasn't come yet, the goldenrod flower moth. And this is what its caterpillars look like. I don't know why it hasn't found our goldenrod yet, but this is part of the fun, part of the game. It's anticipation. It's like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. Every year I go out and check my goldenrod, hoping to find the goldenrod flower moth. One of these years I will, and that'll be a great day. Planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. I don't know why a lot of people don't like Virginia creeper. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. It makes very nutritious berries for the birds in the fall. It's a great pollinator plant, believe it or not. Its flowers are not showy for humans, but the native bees love them. And it's the primary host plant of many of our large sphinx moths that are the primary part of cardinal diets. Things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Wanted the double-toothed prominent because it's such a cool-looking caterpillar. That's good enough reason. It's an elm specialist. I got some seeds out of the curb from elm trees at the University of Delaware. Those trees never died from the blight. Planted them. Now they're, they're 80 feet tall now. The caterpillar came right away. So that was a big, it was American elm I planted. Big success. Wanted the evening primrose moth because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. So we planted evening primrose. The moth came and spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. That's very cute. And we planted lots of oak trees. I want to focus on oaks. These are just examples of the plants we put in our yard, but I want to focus on oaks for a while because they're such important plants. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York. It's enormous. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. And I've heard people say pretty often, actually, I don't want to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy an oak when it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what an oak is doing for your property, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted my oaks, most of them as acorns, free, or 2-foot bare root whips, $1.50 each. And right away, they started to bring the moth populations to our property that support the food webs, that support everything else there. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, the juvenile's dusky wing, yellow-shouldered moth, the orange-headed epicalema, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the orange-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the delightful dagger moth, the pleasant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown buccolatrix, the white botch heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-lined panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to our oaks, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that has popped its head above the leaves, and here's a crocus geometer standing on the ground eating the leaves of that oak. You don't have to wait centuries for your oak to start to contribute to the ecosystem in your yard. This is what our yard will look like about a month from now. I'm still sitting in this window right up here. I show you this just to convince you that we're very traditional. There's my lawn right there. But we put a lot of plants back. And I noticed right away when we put plants on our yard, the moths that eat those plants come and become part of the food web. So I made it a goal 4 years ago to try to take a picture of every species of moth on our property. And I'm still at it. And I am up to 1,035 species of moths that I have photographed at our house. And we've got 10 acres, but Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres, which means on 1/240,000th of the land area, we've got 40% of all the moths that occur in Pennsylvania. And because so many of these are types of bird foods, we have recorded 59 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Not flew by, but bred. You know, this past fall, we saw this headline. World Wildlife Fund says that Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. But I'm thinking, not at our house. I bet we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3, and it didn't take nearly that long. And we did it simply by putting the native plants back that support the life around us. So I'm telling you this so that you don't despair when you see these headlines. We can turn this around if we all get busy and plant the plants that support the life around us. But I know what you're thinking. We've got 10 acres, and you know, what about all the people in suburbia who don't have 10 acres? Will it work on smaller plots? Good question. Let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They only have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than what Cindy and I have. And they're in the middle of a development. All their neighbors had the big lawns, a typical development. When they brought the property, they had to get rid of their invasive plants. The big one there is bush honeysuckle, Amur honeysuckle. So they got rid of those. They planted a lot of species of native plants, and then they put in a water feature they call it a bubbler. And then they sat back and started to count the birds that were using their yard. And they are up to 149 bird species that have used their yard, including 35 warbler species. Just to put that in perspective, on 18 times more land, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So does it work on smaller properties? Yes, it does. What about in urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago, because right on the other side of this wall here is one of the runways of O'Hare Airport. Right over here is Kennedy Expressway. Pam has 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. And she's not connected to any natural area. So she's a little island. But she did the same thing. She got rid of her invasive plants, put in 60 species of native plants, plus a water feature for the birds. And then she sat back and started to count the birds that are using her yard. And she's up to, actually, it's 118 species of birds that have used her yard, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock right there. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, you can go to Pam's house in Chicago because she's landscaped her yard properly. What about city centers, though? 82% of us live in cities. So this is important. Well, in 2014, I was staring at this plant, Asclepius tuberosa. People call it butterfly weed, which reminds me, we have a serious marketing issue with our native plants. We call them weeds and wonder why people don't plant them. So let's not call it butterfly weed. Let's call it Monarch's Delight. All right, 2014, I'm staring at Monarch's Delight, and the first thing I saw were 2 species of leafcutter bees, megachilid bees, that I know they're megachilid bees because they carry their pollen on their tummy, not on their legs. Well, they have very strict requirements. You don't have leafcutter bees unless you have a lot of pollen and nectar and access to soft leaves. Things like redbud are perfect because they carve out the edges of those leaves, leave little semicircles where they've carved it out. And then they roll up that leaf tissue into a tube, stuff it full of pollen, lay an egg on it, close up the ends, and that's how they reproduce. Then they put that whole package into a crack or a crevice. Well, there was a redbud growing right next to the Monarch's Delight, and I'm pretty sure that is why there were leafcutter bees there. I'm also pretty sure that's why there were bumblebees there. Remember, bumblebees overwinter as queens. So when they come out in the spring, they don't have any workers to help them start that colony. It's a very dangerous time for that bumblebee lineage. They've got to get a colony going, and it won't happen unless they have access to lots of pollen and nectar that's very easy to gather. That's exactly what redbud provides for those bumblebees. Then I saw a monarch. Actually, I saw two monarchs. Now remember, this is 2014. I had gone all of 2013 without seeing a single monarch. That was the low point of the monarch population in the East. Only 3.6% of our monarchs left compared to 1976. So here, this was June too, very early for us to be seeing monarchs. So, this was great news. Maybe they weren't going to disappear after all. Why were they there? Well, they had Monarch's Delight, but there was another species of milkweed as well. I think it's purple milkweed that was in bloom, but they had their host plant, everything they needed, nectar to drink and a place to lay their eggs. Do you know where I was? I was on the High Line in the middle of Manhattan, New York, 30 feet above the taxis. This is the High Line is a renovated, elevated railroad that has been turned into a tourist destination. Somebody went up there years ago. It was abandoned, and they saw a whole bunch of native plants growing that nobody had planted or tended. They were there all by themselves. So they decided to make it a tourist destination. But this is the amount of nature that's along the High Line. It is just a 3-foot strip. This is Rick Dark. He was always after me to go to the High Line, see the beautiful plants. Well, I'm not much of a city boy, so I dragged my feet. And also going and seeing beautiful plants with nothing using them is actually depressing to me. And that's what I thought I would see in the middle of Manhattan. I mean, I couldn't imagine that anything would be using the plants in the High Line in the middle of Manhattan. How would they get there? But I was completely wrong. I was only up there 20 minutes and I saw what I just described to you. There are birds there. Somebody's done a study of the bees on the High Line right now. There are 30 species using the High Line. So this has convinced me, I'm a convert now, that if we use thoughtful plantings of native plants, we can bring nature back to almost anywhere. That's a real uplifting story. But there are 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way. And one of them is we've got to reduce the area that's in lawn, because lawn is not the direction we want to go. Lawn is a great status symbol, but it's an ecological deadscape. We've got 40 million acres of lawn. That's the size of New England, that taken out of production. So we can keep our status symbol. We've got these cultural norms, but we can have less of it. Let's take half the area out of lawn and plant important plants in the other half. The area of lawn we keep will still be manicured. We'll still be good citizens. Our neighbors will still love us. But if we take half of the area out of lawn and essentially rewild it, that's 20 million acres that we have to work with. We can create a new national park. And if we do it at home, we can call it Homegrown National Park. And it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, plus Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. We will have the largest park in the country. What do we get when we put a park at home? You get the opportunity to develop a personal relationship with the natural world. There are a lot of health benefits to doing that, but you can do it at your own time and your own pace. All you have to do is go outside. You can avoid crowds. You don't have to go to a real national park. And if you do, there'll be millions of other people there. It's free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the road. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone. And personally, I don't know how you can develop that personal relationship with the natural world unless you are alone, one-on-one. You get to know each other together. This is critically important for our kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder. So we get 30 kids, we put them on a bus with a teacher and they drive for an hour and they walk around a natural area for an hour. Teacher tells them not to touch anything and they get back in the bus and then they go home. And I'm sure that's better than nothing. But what that's really is an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling you not to touch anything. If they have part of the natural world at home, all they have to do is go outside alone. No parental supervision. Let them develop that relationship with the natural world. Why is that important? They're going to be the future stewards of the planet. And if they don't have a relationship with what they're stewarding, they're going to be lousy stewards. And we can't afford any more lousy stewardship. And if they're lucky, maybe they will learn how to hunt lizards. I am learning this from my own granddaughter. This is Zoe, who lives in Hawaii on a very modest piece of nature. It's a piece of grass and a hedge. But there are anole lizards there. So she sent me this picture, very excited to teach me how you hunt anole lizards. You get in the ground and you disguise yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards don't see you coming. Then you crawl very slowly toward the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress. That's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard. You catch the lizard. You put it in an aquarium. And there's your personal relationship. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be on the ground in her best dress catching lizards the rest of her life. I don't think. But I guarantee she's going to remember catching lizards in Hawaii the rest of her life. And I also guarantee that that experience is going to help her be a good steward of the planet. If you want your kids to do more than catch lizards, get Nancy Stranisti's book, Nature Play at Home. Dozens of examples of how to get your kids outside and exposed to that natural world. Very, very valuable book. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, this is our new website, homegrownnationalpark.org. You can go and you get yourself on the map. You follow the directions and put your location in, and the amount of land that you are committed, to planting in natives, the amount of lawn you're taking out, or the area you already have protected. And that information will light up your part of your county. You'll get to see who else is joining Homegrown National Park. This is our attempt to get beyond the choir, to convince other people that this is a national effort. We all have to join in. We want to make that 20 million acre conversion. Right now, we're 1% done. There are 5,000 people that have joined the map, but we'll get some more. And why stop at 20 million acres? Let's do the whole country. Okay, we're gonna shrink the lawn. What are the plants we're gonna put in the area we take out of the lawn? Well, some of them have to be what I'm calling keystone plants. Now, remember the Roman arch? The stone in the middle of that arch is called the keystone. If you take it out of the arch falls down. If you take keystone plants out of our local food webs, the food web collapses. That's how important those plant species are. We found that just 5% of our native plant species are making 75% of the caterpillar food that drives our food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives our food webs, which means 86% of our native plants are contributing, but not all that much. If we're building an ecological house in our yards, the keystone plants are the 2x4s that hold that house up. They are essential. They're not the only thing you need, but you can't build the house out of wallpaper. So we're going to have those keystone plants. Then we can add the other plants and round out our house. So the question no longer is simply, are natives better than non-natives? On average, they certainly are in terms of supporting the life around us. But there are a lot of natives that don't do all that well either. So let's put the most ecologically powerful plants into our yards. And certainly choose them over the ecologically destructive plants. The Asian ornamentals that have become invasive escape our yards and are biologically polluting all the land around us, ecologically castrating it. I get an email once in a while from somebody who says, don't I know that ginkgos, Ginkgo biloba from Asia, actually grew in North America 7 million years ago. That makes them native. That means we can plant them and everything will be great. Yes, I do know the ginkgos grew in North America 7 million years ago. We can argue about whether that makes them native today, but I'm not going to have that argument because that's not the metric anymore. It's not whether they're native or not. It's what's important is what they're doing. I don't care if ginkgos grew on the moon 7 million years ago. They produce 0 species of caterpillars. Now, I know there's 2 rare records of caterpillars on ginkgo. I've never found one. You're never going to find one either. If you really want to find caterpillars, where do you go? You go to the most powerful keystone plants in 84% of the counties in North America. Oaks, any one of the oaks. 557 species of caterpillars supported in the mid-Atlantic states, 900 species nationwide. There is no other plant genus that comes close to that. And this is the role of keystone oaks in my yard. Now, remember, I've taken pictures of 1,035 moth species so far. We'll get to the butterflies at some point. But out of the 1,035 species, 910 have known host plants. So there's more than 100. I don't know what they're eating. Of the 910 species, 270 species use oaks. We have 69 genera of native woody plants on our property, and only one of them is the genus Quercus. And we've got hundreds of genera of herbaceous plants. So oaks represent less than 1.5% of our woody plant diversity and way less than 1% of our total plant diversity. But they're supporting at least 30% of our moth species diversity. That's the role of a keystone plant. If we took oaks out of our yard, it would be far less diverse. How do you find out what the keystone plants are where you live? You go to National Wildlife Federation website and put in your zip code. Well, actually go to the Native Plant Finder part of the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list, the most powerful plants in your county, both woody plants and herbaceous plants, will pop up. This is what a typical list will look like, and it's abbreviated because I run out of room here, but oaks are very powerful, native cherries are powerful, native willows are powerful, and so on. Now notice I say native oaks, native cherries, native willows, native birches. If you go to the nursery and say, I want to buy a cherry, they're going to sell you an Asian flowering cherry. If you say, I want to buy a willow, you get a weeping willow from Turkey. I want to buy a birch, you get a European birch. I want to buy a maple, you get a Japanese maple. You've got to specify that you want a native member of these native genera, because if you get non-native members, you're going to reduce caterpillar use by 65%. That's not the goal. We've done that experiment, we know. These are the top herbaceous plants in terms of both supporting caterpillars and our native bees, our native bee specialists. Between goldenrods and the various genera of asters and sunflowers, there are over 40 species of bees that specialize on those genera that will be in your yard if you, or could be in your yard if you have them, but definitely won't be in your yard if you don't have them. That's the power of keystone species. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to plant keystone plants and bring in lots of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security lights at night, which of course is not the goal. There's a lot of research coming out in the last few years, some of it from Europe, that is very convincingly suggesting that light pollution at night is one of the major reasons our insect populations are declining, one of the major causes. These are all the ways that lights kill insects at night. Through exhaustion, the moth flies around till it just drops. Collisions, they collide with the light bulb, they get incinerated, they die of dehydration, the bat comes and eats them. Bright lights blind a lot of nocturnal insects, and it keeps them from doing what they're supposed to be doing. Now, to me, this actually is good news. We have to turn around insect declines. It is not an option to allow them to disappear or even become rare. So that's top priority. We've got to turn that around. And if this turns out to be a major cause of insect decline, that's great news because it's the easiest to turn around. All you do is flick a switch. What could be easier? But I know what you're going to say. I can't turn the light out over my garage because the bad man will come. All right, put a motion sensor on your light so that it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to notice is how often the bad man does not come. And if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. You know, mercury vapor bulbs are the very worst. They're so attractive to insects. Put in a yellow bulb. Yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to insects, and yellow LED lights are the least attractive. If we switched out our white bulbs for yellow LED bulbs, overnight, we would save billions of insects in the summertime and billions of dollars too, because they're much more energy efficient. All right, we're going to shrink our lawn. We're going to bring in keystone plants. We're going to turn out our lights. Then we're going to invite Mosquito Joe to come kill all our insects. We just have no end to the ways we can kill our insects. This is a booming business around the country. And Mosquito Joe will say, well, you know, the fog he's spraying here is a natural product, so it's okay. It is a natural product. It's pyrethroids it's made from chrysanthemums. But cyanide is a natural product too. So that's not a good argument. He also says it only kills mosquitoes, and that's not even close to true. The big thing is it doesn't work. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. You control them in the larval stage. In order to control mosquitoes in the adult stage, you have to kill 90% of them. Studies have shown Mosquito Joe kills 10% of them. It's not even close to working. And that's why he has to keep coming back and back and back. Plus, he's expensive. The way that every homeowner can control mosquitoes with very little effort is to get a bucket, fill it full of water, put in straw or hay for a couple of days. We'll leave it in there and it'll ferment. What's happening is the algae and diatoms that mosquito larvae eat will build up in this bucket. And that becomes irresistible to mosquitoes that want to lay their eggs. They lay their eggs in the bucket over anything else. Then you put in a mosquito dunk. You go to the hardware store, buy a sheet of mosquito dunks. They're not expensive. This is Bacillus Thuringiensis. It's a natural bacterium that kills aquatic diptera. And the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is a mosquito. And it only kills mosquitoes. So if a dragonfly gets in here, it doesn't hurt it. If your dog licks it or a bird drinks it, doesn't hurt it at all. So this is an effective way to control mosquitoes. And some people say, well, why don't you just dump the bucket out? You can after the mosquitoes, the eggs have been laid. But if you keep it going, they keep laying eggs in there and they keep dying. So it just lasts a lot longer. Much better approach because it only kills mosquitoes. Fourth thing we need to do is to develop landscapes, design landscapes that allow caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? Well, I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon and hangs from one of the branches, then the adult emerges, and then it does it all over again. Everything happens on the tree. And I wish all the caterpillars did that, but most of them don't. 480 species, 94%, after they finish growing, drop from the tree and then try to wiggle their way underneath the ground to pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that is under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree, and we mow and trample our ground to the point where it's so compacted the caterpillars can't get underground. So the typical way that we landscape becomes an ecological trap. It calls in moths, adults, to lay their eggs. The caterpillars grow and then drop down and die. I am convinced this is another major cause of insect declines. And of course, the cement landscape is even less of a viable option. I'm not trying to discourage the use of trees in cities. I'm trying to discourage the profligate use of cement as a default landscape. We know it's a bad idea. We know it destroys watersheds. And it also releases a tremendous amount of greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide. This is what most people do. You have a big tree in the middle of a lawn. Now, nobody's measured how well caterpillars survive in a situation like this. I was going to do it last summer, but the virus said no. But I guarantee survivorship is much higher in a situation like this, where you have a tree and then a layered landscape, maybe a dogwood up here and then a native azalea and then ferns and ground cover. The caterpillars drop down to a safe site. They can easily get below the surface of the ground because it's not compacted, or they can spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's hiding under these plants here. Very high survivorship. This is where you can do your spring ephemeral gardening. This is how you shrink the lawn. Put beds around your trees. Make them big beds and have far less lawn. Safe sites. This is where you can use your ground covers, things like wild ginger, May-apples, foam flower, ferns. This is a hotel in the middle of Athens, Georgia. These are red maples. So any caterpillar in here can drop down, even though it's the middle of the city, and that's a safe site. They can complete their development. We can do a lot better under our trees. Another grad student, Desiree Narango, did some excellent work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And her results suggest that there is room for compromise in our selection of native plants. What she did was look at how well suburban landscapes that were landscaped primarily with natives, none of them were 100% native, sustained chickadee populations compared to traditional landscaping that was dominated by introduced plants. And the first thing she found out is that when those landscapes are dominated by introduced plants, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So the amount of bird food is reduced 75%. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. Now, every landscape had a nest box up in it, but the chickadees would come and look around and say, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try to reproduce. If they did reproduce, they laid 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. And if you put all those numbers into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard, from none to 100%, this is what you get. This dotted line is replacement rate. That is the rate at which the population has to make babies in order to replace the adults that die every year. If you reproduce at this rate, you've got a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, you've got a growing population. But if you're below the line here, you make fewer babies, that's a shrinking, unsustainable population. Right here, generously speaking, is where those lines overlap, which suggests you can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native, as long as it's not invasive, without destroying your local food web. In other words, 70% of your woody plant biomass should be natives. And this is the area of compromise that I am excited about. Because if my message was we can't have any non-native plants at all, very few people would listen. We love our non-native plants. You can have your ginkgo, you can have your crepe myrtle, no Bradford pear, that's invasive, as long as it doesn't dominate the landscape. It's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It is the absence of the native plants that support those food webs. So get more of these natives into our yard, we can tolerate non-natives. Can we use natives in informal designs? Of course we can. This is a garden in North Carolina. They sent me this picture. They're replacing the non-natives with natives. Here's Joe Pye. Notice I didn't call it Joe Pye weed. It is not a weed. And when they finish, they're going to send me another picture. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe all the time. I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a traditional suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Sure, just put a little fence around it. It takes what most people say, well, there's a bunch of weeds, and formalizes into something that's a planned, beautiful part of your landscape. And it services a number of species of bees. It's not very big. So, bigger the better. But let's just review very quickly why we need pollinators. If you listen to the commercials, it will be because they pollinate a third of our crops. It's actually about a 1/12 of our crops. But I don't like that explanation because a lot of people think if they don't live next to a farm, they don't need any pollinators. Pollinators are far more than our crops, believe me. They pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we would lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. Not an option. Where do we need pollinators? Everywhere. Everywhere we need plants, including our yards. What about this design? It's a Drew Latham design, much bigger. It's formalized. It's beautiful. Imagine the amount of life here compared to the amount of life here. Seems like a no-brainer to me. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can, and more are doing it. This is becoming commonplace. It's wonderful. Minnesota kicked it off a long time ago with a cost-sharing program that encouraged homeowners to reduce the area of lawn or get rid of it altogether by putting in appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. Get paid to do that. Pennsylvania, I just learned about this two weeks ago, has a lawn conversion program. You can get up to $5,000 per acre to help you convert your lawn to native plantings. Now, this was designed to help watersheds, but I don't care what the motivation is. The end result is you'll have a lot more biodiversity. Maryland, I think, is a similar program. Virginia has a similar program, probably many other places. There's an island off Florida where residents are being paid by the municipality to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to burrow in the front yard. This is how the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. So if you have an endangered species on your property, you get paid to take care of it rather than fined if you use your property. Everybody would want one. Missouri, I think St. Louis, Missouri, Fayetteville, Arkansas have a bounty on calorie pears. If you take out a calorie pear, you get a free tree replacement. And even public utilities are getting into the act. In San Antonio, the San Antonio water system giving people $100 coupons to take out their thirsty non-natives and putting in water efficient native plants. And of course, we have the big lawn conversion programs in the far west in California. $2 per square foot rebate for getting rid of your thirsty grass and putting in appropriate xeric plantings. I think we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And this is the first one. We've assumed that nature is not essential. We like it. Some people even think it's important, but it's not essential, which means when push comes to shove, when resources are short, which is always, nature takes a backseat. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there was this wall-sized poster there, which epitomizes, I think, our society's view of conservation. We need to save wildlife for future generations, presumably so future generations can enjoy it. This was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for creating the national park system. They're so wonderful, we have to save them so future generations can enjoy them. But to me, that suggests nature is there just for entertainment. No wonder we don't think it's essential. Entertainment's nice, but it's not essential. But this is not why we need nature. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. Second misstep, we've assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. And if we persist with this attitude, we're going to fail. We won't be doing conservation on enough areas, and they'll be too small and too isolated from each other. David Quammen has an excellent relationship between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That is 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I hate that language because it suggests they're places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even to a great extent, including our agricultural areas. So what we need to do is glue our rug back together again. We need to use a healthy dose of those keystone plants, then diversify with other native plants. We're not just building biological corridors so that plants and animals can move back and forth between viable habitats. We're going to create viable habitats where we live, where we work, where we play, and where we farm. In other words, we're going to start to share our human spaces with nature. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists. We didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every human being. It was just a few ecologists, few conservation biologists. But I don't know why we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every human being, because every human being on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody bear the responsibility of good Earth stewardship? Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said that the Western settler mindset is, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with these mindsets, you're taught them. We're good at teaching this one. We have been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations towards Earth stewardship, every one of us. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you really can save it where you live. And this approach empowers each one of us, which is important because right now so many people feel powerless. The Earth's problems are huge, and it really does seem like one person cannot make a difference. But in this case, the cliche is correct. One person can make a difference, and you can see that difference. You can measure it. One person can go outside, plant those keystone plants, reduce the area that's in lawn, put in a pollinator garden, and get rid of your invasive species, and watch the life come back to your yard. And it won't take long. You become an important cog in the future wheel of conservation. It also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. Just worry about your little piece of the planet that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you're going to start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or a preserve. They're all underfunded, understaffed. They will love you. So as property owners or as volunteers, each one of us has the power. We certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate, which ultimately will determine our own fate. Now, I believe I have convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Doug, for that presentation. I love hearing about oaks, and I hope a lot of other Iowans are too, since our state tree is a bur oak. It looks like we do have a couple questions in the comments. The first one we have here is, I removed the invasives from under my bur oaks, and I wondered what would be the best native plants to replace those invasives.
Well, if you're in an area that was oak savanna, and I bet you are, the prairie plants that are common as in those prairie states, and there's dozens of species. So liatris and sunflowers and goldenrod, all of those species are great. You want a diversity of prairie plants. So I don't know how close together your oaks are, but in a true oak savanna, there's plenty of sun that will support those prairie plants. So that's what I would recommend.
Awesome. And then there is another part to that question that says, what is inside the galls of skeleton weed?
Skeleton weed? I don't know. Most of the gallers on oaks are synipid gall wasp, but on many of the herbaceous plants, there's another big family of gallers called the Cicetomyiids. Those are gall midges. So without really knowing what skeleton weed is, I would guess it's a gall midge, but I'd have to look that one up. I'm sorry about that.
All right, the other question we have here is, people hesitate to plant oaks because they get so large. What would you say to people whose yards can't handle a 50-foot wide tree?
I would say plant a small oak. I've got a book coming out Monday, March 30th, called The Nature of Oaks. And in that book is a list of oaks that are either ground covers or bushes or small trees, both in the West and in the East, that are landscape options. A lot of them are not in the trade, but they should be and could be. So every oak is not a giant tree. Something like Quercus prinoides, the dwarf chestnut oak. It makes acorns when it's 5 feet tall. Would be a great option for somebody with a smaller property. So you don't have to give up the power of that genus if you have a smaller property. There are lots of small options.
Awesome. That was our last question so far, but really quick, I just wanted to tell everyone that in the chat, I put the link to Homegrown National Park, as well as the native plant finder in there. And then you'll also find the evaluation to today's session in the comments as well. I'm going to show everyone just super fast where you can find that on our Siouxland Garden Show website. So if you go to the speakers tab and you go under Doug's session, you'll find the highlighted evaluation. So go ahead and fill that out. We'd love to hear your feedback on today's presentation. And then in the chat box as well, I'm going to toss the information in there for the Grow With Us or the Grow Wild with the Les Hills Wild Ones chapter that's happening in the Siouxland area. So they are really promoting the Homegrown National Park in the Siouxland area. So if you're interested in kind of linking up with the projects that they are doing, I'd recommend reaching out to them. So definitely jump in and work with them. So Doug, this was a really great presentation to kind of spark the interest of homeowners, but then also some different projects that master gardeners can get involved in, or maybe spark a new project idea for them. So thank you so much for joining us. And then folks, make sure to join us this afternoon at 3 p.m. Central Time to learn a little bit about annuals and perennials in the landscape. So a little bit of a different twist to today's session. So we look forward to seeing everyone there. And thank you again, Doug.
Well, thank you.